Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the hottest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, join me once again as we continue to go through our Basically series. For those of you who are unaware how this series works, this is where we put together the best decks for beginners and budget players out there. We're talking the kind of decks you can put together that will not require you to use a single rare or mythic to build.
Say what?
That's right. So without further ado, let's show off today's deck, a 4-color build that I am putting together that's called Basically Caves. Longtime viewers of the channel know how we do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we dive right in. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is a 4-color deck that is focused on utilizing white, black, red, and green. You're looking at an average mana curve about 2.8, and we're going to be rocking 16 creatures, 4 instants, 5 sorceries, 4 artifacts, 8 enchantments, and 23 lands. Caves are a newish type of land that was recently introduced to us from the last trip to Ixalan, and with a little creative deck building, we found a way to make a spicy mid-range deck despite the fact that caves do not have as strong a support as say the Gates lands or Desert lands. So you may have to ask yourself right now, how can a budget 4-color pile of caves even work?
Good question!
So without further ado, let's begin talking about the creatures in the deck. Starting in the 1-drop slot, we have Ruin Lurker Bat. I've talked about this card before in other deck techs, but to reiterate one more time, it's a simple little card that's going to help us just gain some life, and it's evasive because it has flying. If we do descend at the end of our turn, we will get to scry 1 to kind of help us filter through our draws. In the 2-drop slot here, we have Deep Cavern Bat. Again, another bat, so we kind of have a little sub-theme of bats, and you'll see why in just a minute. When the bat enters, we get a little peeky peek at what our opponent is holding in their hands, and we get to exile a non-land card, at least until the bat leaves the battlefield. Our only other 2-drop here is going to be Starscape Cleric. So this Starscape Cleric, we actually haven't used this card before, but I want to talk about it just briefly. Starscape Cleric is a 2-mana 2/1 bat cleric that has the Offspring ability, which means you can pay an extra 3 mana to make a copy of it. It also has flying, however, the creature cannot block, but whenever we gain life, our opponent will lose 1 life. So we can kind of do some life gain and drain shenanigans if we do at least have 1 out, and ideally, if we can get a copy of this out, we'll be able to then drain out our opponent even faster. And then finally, in the 8-drop slot, although this is not actually something you're going to cast for 8 mana, so hear me out for just a second here. We're also going to be rocking Gargantuan Leech. So the Leech, although it is technically an 8-mana 5/5, which sounds pretty bad, it will be 1 less to cast for each cave we control and each cave card in our graveyard. It also has lifelink, so this will help offset one of the kind of small hindrances, if you will, of the deck, which I'll again explain once we get to the lands. Circling back over to the non-creature spells, we're going to jump back to the 1-drop slot. We have Duskrow's Reliquary as one of our spot removal cards. Granted, you will have to sacrifice an artifact or a creature in order to utilize this fully, but once you do, you can then exile an artifact or creature until the Duskrow's Reliquary leaves the battlefield. It also has built-in protection of War 2, which is great for us to keep it on the battlefield. For additional support, we're also going to be utilizing Deadly Dispute. Same thing, we will have to sacrifice a creature or artifact. However, we get to draw 2 cards and create a treasure token just to help us churn through our deck. For additional spot removal for things that are a little bit more on the pesky side, we'll have Rite of Oblivion. Take note of the fact that, again, you will have to sacrifice something in order to make sure this works, but then you can exile a non-land permanent. And with the flashback ability, you can then cast this again later on in the game for an additional 4 mana from the graveyard. As far as what we are going to be sacrificing, we have plenty of copies of enchantments here we can take advantage of. So first off, the star of the show, Bat Colony here. So let's talk about this card for just a moment. Bat Colony is a 3-mana enchantment that simply reads, when Bat Colony enters, you create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying for each mana from a cave spent to cast it. Whenever a cave you control enters, you get a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Whew! So for a simple little uncommon here, we can make as much as 3 bat tokens. We can then utilize those for either aggro purposes or to sacrifice them for any one of our other cards here to control the battlefield and keep things in check against our opponent. And our other enchantment of choice is going to be Spelunking here, which is an incredible enchantment that goes very well with our whole deck. So let's talk about this again, in case of you are still unaware of how powerful it is. Spelunking is a 3-mana enchantment that reads, when it enters, you get to draw a card. Then, you can put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you put a cave onto the battlefield this way, you will gain 4 life, and lands you control enter untapped. This is an incredibly powerful card that's going to help kind of keep our whole deck together. It is the glue that ensures that we can then utilize our caves to their full advantage. For additional support here, we'll also take advantage of Calamitous Cave-In here. So this is a 4-mana Wrath that is literally designed for caves. It'll deal X amount of damage to each creature and each planeswalker, where X is the number of caves we control, plus the number of cave cards in your graveyard. This is an incredible card to help us keep control of the battlefield. But what is the cave ratio going to be when it comes to the land base? So without further ado, let's go ahead and show you exactly how the breakdown is going to work. So we're obviously going to utilize the Hidden Courtyard, Necropolis, Volcano, and Nursery, all the mono-colored ones in the deck. Granted, of course, they will all come into play tapped, so your deck is going to feel a little slow, but once once we get that spelunking out on the field, this shouldn't be a problem for us. However, we do need to make sure that we try to fix our colors as best as we can. So we're also going to utilize Forgotten Monument here, which is perfect for our whole game plan. It's an uncommon cave that simply just allows us to have all of our caves can pay 1 life to then tap for any color of mana we need it for. So this is again why we are utilizing bats in the first place. The bats themselves that have lifelink will allow us to stabilize along with the leech here. So this way the life loss that we get from Forgotten Monument won't be a problem for us. We're also going to utilize a copy of Volatile Fault here just again to take off any kind of enemy creature land or non-basic we don't want to deal with. We can make a treasure that can help us do some fixing. We'll also utilize a single copy of Pit of Offerings as a light type of Graveyard Hate in the main deck. And then finally, copies of Cavernous Maw here. Again, this is an amazing card for us specifically for the land base. Only because, again, this can become a creature land if we need to, but it only really works because we're utilizing caves as our entire mana base. Now, if you are interested in taking this deck into best of 3, here's what I'm going to recommend for you. So this really will come down to whatever you're kind of dealing with in the first game here. So in other words, if you do need more removal, we'll add in copies of Fatal Push here. If you do need maybe more removal, but also you want to be more aggro, you can throw in copies of Case of the Gateway Express here. We'll have a lot of bat tokens that are evasive, so this works out perfectly. If we do need more sacrifice to deal with more non-land permanents, another copy of Rite of Oblivion will be, of course, in here. If you do want to deal with graveyard shenanigans, you'll throw in some Graveyard Hate with Soul Guide Lantern, usually my catch-all that I always recommend to anybody. Dewdrop here can help us bring back some of our bats from the graveyard back to the battlefield so they can be reutilized again and again. If we need a little bit of extra support, one more extra copy of Calamitous Cave-In for another Wrath. If we do want to try to slowly outgrind our opponent with more value, a single copy of Wardens of the Cycle here can help us either gain some life or help us draw a card, although we will have to lose life in the process. And if we do need more tokens to just utilize for extra value by sacrificing, we can rebuild some of those tokens with copies of Growing Ranks here, because with the beginning of our upkeep, it'll allow us to populate. If you don't remember, populate just allows us to create a token that's a copy of another token we already have on the battlefield. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content. You can support me monthly for a small amount on Patreon, where I have all of my extended bonus footage posted. We also have a Redbubble spot where you can buy merch like stickers and shirts, or for free, all you can just do also is just join our growing community on Discord. Your support helps keep this channel going. All links are in the details below. Now, as far as tips and tricks I can give you for the deck, here's what I'm going to recommend for you. Let's actually be honest about the weakness first, which is, of course, a lot of your lands are going to come into play tapped, so that means that it's going to feel very slow and clunky. However, because of how the deck is designed, you should be able to catch up once you start getting your bats onto the battlefield. Remember, Deep Cavern Mat is meant to disrupt. Most likely it'll get blown up at some point, but if you can get at least a point or two of damage to help you offset some of the life lost, that life gain will go a long way. Ruin Lurker Bat is again going to be only here just to help you stabilize for a little bit. It can chump block if you need to, and of course if you do manage to trigger off the Descend ability, that's just an extra bonus on top of it. Ideally, however, you should have in your hand one of your key pieces to help you stabilize. If you have Bat Colony, that'll put out a bunch of tokens, so if your opponent is aggro, you can kind of buy out some time with that. Or say like you have Spelunking, this at least will start making all of your lands untapped when they come into play, making it a lot easier for you to then start casting what you need to. And of course, ideally, try to have Forgotten Monument come out as soon as possible, so that way all of your mana is fixed, so that way you can cast everything you need when you need it. If you see that your opponent is starting to go a little wide, you might want to hold off on sacrificing a bat or two, or at least time it so this way when you do manage to try to block with it, you can then sacrifice for value, make sure they don't get that damage to your life total, and again, wait it out until you can get a Calamitous Cave-In, so that way you can just blow up the whole board. The biggest advantage this deck actually has is, despite the fact that the mana base does look very clunky, it actually functions quite well for it, and you actually have no problem gaining a ton of life back once you have everything on the field. Your other major advantage is going to be how diverse your game plan is. It again does look like a pile, but you have Wraths in this deck on the main part. You have a lot of spot removal that is very diverse depending on what your opponent throws at you, and of course, those excess copies of Spelunking and Bat Colony will come in handy once you do need to cast Rite of Oblivion over and over again. The other major weakness, of course, of the deck is because of how diverse it is, you're going to have to be very good at managing your resources to figure out what you need when you need it. This is without a doubt, compared to most of the other basically decks that I've done, probably the hardest one to pilot just because of how diverse it is. But if you've made it this far into the series, I would definitely say you probably have more than enough tools and skills now to pilot this, as well as probably most likely better than me. Now, if you do like what this deck is trying to do and you're interested in land-based strategies beyond this, as always, I will show you on screen right now a couple of quick snapshots of previous deck techs that are in a similar vein. If you haven't already noticed, several links of those have been scattered throughout this video, so be sure to click on any one of those, again, if you're interested in land-based strategy decks like this. But now with all that out of the way, here are my final thoughts that I want to give on this deck. In terms of all of the ultra budget decks I've put together over the years, I think this is perhaps one of the most jankiest and most complicated decks I've ever put together. And you saw today, 4 colors definitely makes this deck a lot more harder than probably it has to be. However, if you've seen already how the strategy works, some way somehow, thanks to that land base, it all awkwardly ends up working out in the end, if you know how to pilot this just correctly. So, to put it another way, if you're a fan of complex strategies, if you're a fan of diverse gameplay, and if you're a fan of the kind of deck where you can either sacrifice creatures for value, build up a bunch of a board state to go wide, go big, then I would definitely say, give this deck a try. And I assure you, when you manage to life gain and drain out your opponent with a bunch of bats, or you manage to just beat them down with a giant leech, you're going to have a lot of fun doing so. You'll be very surprised at how you can pull it off on a budget, and you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.